Yeah, so I'm Simon Rommel. I'm an assistant professor at TU Eindhoven, and yeah, I'm in charge of building out this quantum communications testbed, mostly focused on QKD right now. So I will be introducing why do we need all of this. I think I'll beat that quite quick. I'll take very much a telecom perspective to this, right? That's also my background, telecommunications, hardcore telecoms networking. And then we'll look at what is still missing to make quantum safe communications a reality in telecoms networks. And I might be slightly biased, so I'll take a QKD angle to this, but I think we definitely want to also look at PQC to some extent, see where we need both of those, right? What do they contribute to an actual solution in a network? And then Sebastian will talk a little bit more about, yeah, how are we putting all this together? What are the hard bits that we're developing right now for this, and probably also what are the bits that maybe are most interesting to you. So Sebastian will then give the second half of the talk. So very quickly to introduce what are quantum safe communications, or maybe to start with what are secure communications. I think everybody knows that being somehow secure in all the stuff we exchange is quite crucial, right? And I think you can imagine yourself all the applications where you have secure communications going on. Everything in your life nowadays is somehow connected, right? And I think when we talk about quantum safe communications, we probably don't talk about all of these, but we will have to select the use cases that are the most important. But I think we can make the claim maybe, or the summary, that secure communications are absolutely crucial to everything we do. And if we were to lose trust widely in secure communications, we'd somehow be thrown back to the system. So how does this work today? I hope I don't need to tell you that, but it's on the slide anyway. So we have authentication, we have generation and sharing of some secret key, and then we typically have some kind of symmetric crypto going on to actually exchange the data, right? And I think here comes the first part that we can say the symmetric part can be done with AES-256, which we can still consider more or less quantum safe. It's actually the key distribution, the exchange of the key, the authentication that we're worried about, right? That we really have to do something with that. So that's sort of the background. And I guess we all know that this relies on functions that are easy to carry out, but hard to reverse. All right. With quantum computers, this doesn't hold anymore, right? So we have to think about something else. So the problem is the quantum computer, right? The quantum computer that we have to assume, or we know that once we have a large enough quantum computer, we have a problem because it can break the current things that we're doing with asymmetric crypto. When this will happen, no idea. The best estimate probably is somewhere in the next 1 to 3 decades. That's what it claims here on the slides. So whether that is realistic or not, nobody knows. The question is, when do we start having a problem with this, right? And if you say this might happen in 3 decades, why do I actually have to take action now? On one hand, of course, we're all in the business of doing research, figuring out how to do this, right? So we definitely need to take action now. But I think we're already at a point where we have to figure out how can the things that we have developed be moved into actual networks, right? And this is the angle that I said I want to take. So I need to motivate, why do we want to look at this now? Why do we want the industry to work with us in looking at how does this work nowadays in real networks, right? And I think the problem here is that what we're actually doing in networks has a certain lifetime, right? And if you talk to industry, it's not uncommon to say, yeah, we make a PKI, we start making a root certificate, and this has a lifetime of 30 years, right? So we have to always think at the end of the lifetime of that certificate, what will have happened, right? And then you might have data that you have to send from A to B, and you want that data to stay secure for at least 20 years after you send it from A to B, which might be in 30 years where the CA that I made now is still valid, right? So I actually have to look at the next 50 years, what might happen to the security of my data in the next 50 years, right? And that's where we might have a problem if this happens in 3 decades, right? So in that sense, if you think about the security shelf lifetime of your equipment and your data, you'd end up somewhere between 40 and 50, maybe 60 years, right? And if we assume that there is something that happens in 30 years and we have an adversary that just harvests all the data that we're sending today and is happy to decrypt that later, then as you can see here, we already have a problem when we make this assumption that it happens in 50 years, right? So if a break of our crypto happens because a quantum computer comes around, we are in trouble. So what we have to figure out is when do we have to start migrating to something so that we can maintain the security even if that quantum computer comes around, right? And the answer is we have to complete our migration at least 20 years, if that's our security time of our data, before the classical crypto is broken, right? And that's really the reason why we need to figure out what we can do already today. How can we get what we have developed in PQC and QKD into the field, into actual networks? And that's where we are working. So what is the solution? I guess a solution is quantum key distribution, right? And that's what we are looking at in Eindhoven. So what QKD does is it provides shared secrets for encryption that is safe against quantum computers. That much is quite clear, right? And I think for us, QKD is quite key because it promotes this information theoretically secure key material, right? That's a property that only the QKD can give you. And of course, then we say QKD material combined with computational symmetric crypto is considered quantum safe. And in order to really build this entire thing, we have to look at what goes around, right? So the standard model for a QKD link is that we have a quantum channel where we're actually sending our key and we're using the quantum mechanical properties of light, in our case, in order to do the QKD, right? And then we have some kind of channel that is actually a classical channel that we need in order to actually negotiate what is happening over that quantum channel. All right, we need a key management system that actually takes care of whatever comes out of this whole process, right? That's what Sebastian will focus on. And we actually need to do some kind of authentication here, both for the QKD itself and within the whole key management layer. And for this authentication, we have to go back to post-quantum crypto, right? So I think it says a solution at the top. In reality, it should say we need to combine QKD and PQC in order to actually come to some way of being quantum safe, or at least in order to reach the maximum security we can, because that's what you get from QKD. So to put all of this together, basically we can say we want to have quantum secure communications, and what we need is QKD and PQC to build and maintain secure communications for the future, right? That's where we try to go, what we want to do. It's a question right now.
Is there any widely used root CA right now that allows you to use PQC? Or do you really have to build kind of your own certificate?
An existing root CA is usually tied to a certain algorithm, right? So an existing root CA, no. There are mechanisms in the standards that allow to transition and update a root CA. Those standards exist. Those standards are not adopted. Nobody uses them. There is a discussion right now going on whether or not you should try to adopt those standards so that you can transition your root CAs and eventually have two signatures in your certificates, etc. Or whether you really say, no, we have a cut somewhere and we just start using new things. I don't think there is an answer yet. I think the answer is those standards exist, but nobody has picked them up. So far it's a guess, I guess.
What is root C?
A certificate authority. So basically the root of trust for your entire PKI tree, your public key. Any more questions while we're anywhere here?
If you're going to use PQC anyway, then you lose the main advantage of QKD, which is information theoretic security. So why not then use PQC all the way?
That is a good question. I think this is something we are still looking at. What exactly is the advantage you get from QKD in that scenario? Right? And I think there is advantage to be had if you implement this correctly. If you really say we use the PQC to guarantee ourselves the authentication of our entities involved. But then we use the QKD key to get that absolute security for the data that we have eventually exchanged. But making that formally, expressing that formally, the advantage you get from the QKD, that is still very much a work in progress. And I guess we'll be happy to share more about this once we have it ready. Feel free to think with us in this, right? I guess especially Katrin would be quite happy to have more people thinking along, I hope. Yeah. All right. This is where we want to go, right? So what do we need in order to make this happen? So what are the bits that are missing? Or what are the gaps from what we have developed so far towards actually making it useful in the field? The first thing we need if we want to use QKD is the actual QKD equipment, right? And if you go out into the market, there's vendors that will say, here, I have a ready-to-go product. And we are questioning whether that is the case, right? And that's why we're building a testbed to actually figure out, is this fully ready to go? And I think right now the answer is the equipment exchanges keys, yes. Is that equipment mature enough? Is it network ready? The answer probably is no, right? So we're now somewhere in between. And obviously there is then a step to mature that equipment. There's definitely a need to make that equipment smaller and more compact, etc. Right? So that's a very typical thing that you do once you have a prototype, you go to miniaturization, etc. But this is quite hard to do for QKD. So that's definitely a point that needs to be addressed. And then we have the things that are down here, which is the standardization and the security certification of those things. And there's a big gap there. There's a big hole. So that's also something where we have to say, if we want to actually come to this where it can be picked up by a network operator, by a data center, by whoever actually runs infrastructure, we need to have those things in place. Otherwise, we're not actually being serious about what we're doing. Right? But that's definitely something we need to work on. The whole handling of keys, getting the keys towards an application, defining how do we define an application, defining what is a service that needs QKD, etc. Right? This is something that for classical networking has taken quite a while to actually get there. Now we have good mechanisms to describe services, to define services, to negotiate services by software, obviously, for communication. Now we need to do the same things or go through the same process for QKD. And one thing you need there then is to have somehow this key management handing it over towards the application. And there's a bunch of standards from EHCI, which we believe are rather incomplete, and there's definitely work needed there in order to make them actually useful for larger networks. And then definitely there's also this assumption that somehow your application lives right next to your QKD node, and that's physically secure within a node. And I think there is still work needed there to see what is the implication of that for actually applications. What type of applications can you actually do that? Where do we have to think about this? Right? Finally, you need to build out an actual network, right? You need to take this and you need to say, okay, now I have a point-to-point link with QKD. I can have some keys coming out. I can manage those keys, but now I need to make multiple hops out of this. I need to form a mesh, some kind of network, right? And that brings new things with it. Again, a key management system, but also the thought about trusted node architectures, right? I might be able to send a key to my nearest neighbor. That nearest neighbor needs to relay that key to somebody else. But that means my neighbor has seen the key, right? So I need to figure out what level of trust do I need to give that neighbor. Do I need to trust that neighbor forever or for some time? How do I establish this, right? There's plenty of thoughts to be had there. And all of this, all of the above, we need first to build, then to integrate with classical networks, and then to convince people that this is actually the way to go, right? And this is where we come into play, what we try to do. If you try to say, this is what, oh, sorry.
Could I ask something about the previous slide? Sure. You were saying that these keys are being broadcasted through the network?
I did not say broadcast, I said relay.
Sorry, relay.
It's a very different thing.
Does that mean that these individual nodes do sort of node-to-node quantum key distribution and then between nodes?
Yeah, so basically the current QKD protocols, they're always point-to-point, right? Yeah. So if you want to build a network out of this, you have to somehow relay that key that you generate point-to-point over the next point-to-point link. And then you have a chain of point-to-point links, right?
Okay, so you're assuming that there's no such thing as a quantum repeater or so, that there's actually a measurement of the...
That is a much further step, right? Where you say, okay, I want to build a full quantum internet. Then you have to go much beyond what current QKD does, right? Then you typically are talking about entanglement networks, etc., right? And then you think about repeaters, heralding stations, etc. Then you can do these things, but then we basically fall off the left-hand side of that slide where we say this stuff is not even ready yet to properly operate in a very well-controlled lab, right? So we try to be a little bit closer to what can we do for actual communication networks. And there we have to rely on the QKD technology, quantum key distribution as it is today, right? So I think the real quantum internet, however exactly you want to define that, is going to take much longer. And if we are concerned about that threat from quantum computers, we probably need to do something before that comes available, right? But yeah, good point.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? And yeah, if there's any questions, just shout out. Okay. If we are familiar with the classical networking stack, are we familiar with the layer stack of networks where you have physical layers, some kind of, no? All right, so there's an OSI layer stack that you have in classical networks where you really try to say, I have many things going on over a network, but I built a relatively rich structure of layers. I have a physical layer, I have a medium access layer, I have some kind of addressing layer, some kind of IP layer, then I have a bunch of layers on top. So the idea is we define those layers and we define boundaries between those layers. And we make sure that each layer can take care of its job and then hand over to the other layers, right? And basically we also make the definition that the lower layers are terminated more or less at every hop, while the higher layers, they typically go end to end, right? So this OSI layer stack is a very basic and well-known concept in classical communications. And we said, actually, QKD is not that much different. And we can define a layer stack for QKD, right? And we start the same way. We have all the physical stuff down here. And we build systems out of this. We eventually build links. That's effectively your layer 2, 2.5. We build networks and so on. And then we break that stack and say, normally in classical networks, on the top, you would have your sessions, your applications, etc. In the QKD case, actually, the user of your QKD network, right, is the classical network. The network that actually uses that key material, right? So we kind of said, okay, that's the bit that is flipped over here. What we definitely need to put on top is a lot of network control and orchestration. We need to integrate that QKD conceptually and operationally into the classical network. And the idea is that theory, we can do all of this. That's at least what we claim, right? So we try to say, okay, we do full stack development, and obviously I want to back this up. We do development of hardware, right? We make photonic integrated circuits. We make QKD hardware. We build systems for discrete variable and continuous variable QKD. So for different variants of QKD, this is really building equipment, building boxes that eventually go into a network, right? That's not what we want to focus on today. What we're focusing on today is, how do I take these, at best, point-to-point links, right, and make them into a network and eventually make this useful, and a little bit on how do we integrate this into the larger network so it actually becomes a useful technology for the real world. And we want to see what use cases can we demonstrate with this, right? Do we have use cases out there right now that are security critical enough, that are forward-looking enough, that we really can say this is an ideal use case for us to demonstrate this is maybe not quite ready yet to fully put it out in the network, but something that we can use on a testbed basis at TUI. And I mentioned testbed. We're building a testbed, and I will say a few things about what we're actually building at TUI as a testbed. So the lower part is sort of real hard R&D effort building hardware. The upper part is what we call our staging network. And this is where a lot of the activities within Quantum Delta go into, to say, okay, we're building a staging network to show these technologies are ready to use in a semi-realistic or almost realistic network. And then we want to work with other people to show, hey, we can take the last steps towards a fully realistic network. I think there was a question.
Maybe a silly question, but will most of the work that is done here be scalable when quantum internet does become like a reality?
Most is a difficult word. We're definitely planning to build the things that are on the higher layers to be compatible, right? I think when you're looking at networking control, etc., there's quite a few concepts that we need to now establish for QKD. And if we're careful enough to establish them proper, they should still hold for the quantum internet, right? In terms of the hardware that is developed on the bottom of this slide, probably not. Although, if you go even further below the bottom of this slide, the physical components that go into the hardware, right? And the advancements in those, and the way we can integrate them into systems, that very much again should be something that transports. But the word should is carrying a lot of weight. So let's see. But it's also, yeah, much too early to actually make hard statements there. But we do have this in mind. I think that's the main answer.
Yeah.
Other questions? No? All right. Okay. What is a testbed and what do we want to do? We are establishing an open and accessible testbed.
So maybe you can ask a question.
There's one more question, right? Should I skip back then?
So question about the key relay procedure with trusted nodes. What is the maximal distance between trusted nodes that are current QKD state of art allowed for?
All right. There's not a single answer. The most common QKD protocol is the discrete variable QKD. This is the family that, for example, the BB84 protocol falls into, right? Then with decent key rates, you're typically limited to 100, 150 kilometers. There are people now out there that make modifications to this and claim that they can reach 200 kilometers. Typically, the key rates go so far down that it's just not worth it anymore, right? If we think of the continuous variable QKD systems, so the CV QKD systems, typically the distance are even much more limited, but the key rates you get are higher. Finally, if you think of these measurement device independent QKD links, where you basically have two transmitters and a joint receiver in the middle, you effectively double those distances, right? But we are limited to distances that are on the order of magnitude to 100, 200 kilometers, right? That I think is where we can currently say we can operate. Theory says we should be able to push that a bit further, but doing QKD over distances of 1,000 kilometers in fiber is not a thing, at least not with useful key rates. And I think that's something that we just have to admit that, sure, fiber is an extremely good medium for the transmission of light, right? The loss is extremely low. We're talking about fractions of decibels per kilometer. But if we then go to thousands of kilometers, the loss still gets so high that we simply cannot reach useful key rates. I hope that was a fair answer to the question. Okay, back to our testbed. Obviously, we want to work with this technology. We believe that there is some use for this technology and we want to show it to the world. Why do we then need to build a full testbed? The idea is, A, we cannot do all of this alone. We also don't want to do it alone, and we want to be open to the world. And we want to build a platform that other people can come to us and say, can we test together? Right? And here the idea is we build an open and accessible testbed. We deploy QKD in the field. We deploy everything that is around it, so that we can show with what we have, we can build a network. And then we say to people, you believe you can improve on a certain part of that network. We give you all the surroundings to prove that you can improve on that part of the network. Right? So we really want to be a bit of a playground for other researchers, but also for industry to come and see what can be done, right? Without everybody having to build the entire thing, right? So we try to accelerate here the development by saying we can build that platform. And we also have the intention to really provide validation and certification at some point, right? So I mentioned earlier on that standardization and security certification of those things are a big gap, right? So we want to try and contribute to those standards and the mechanism procedures for certification, but in the end also we want to see if we can actually be one of the providers for that certification service, right? And then why does this whole thing have to be open? Well, basically to allow scrutiny and transparency, right? And to make this as fast as possible by just being as open as we can be. And really also to show that we can be compatible with everything that we have in the testbed. And by being quite open, everybody can look at how would this be compatible with what whoever else is doing. Right? So a platform to drive the development, but more importantly, the adoption of QKD, or actually in the medium to long term run of quantum safe communications. Okay, what are we actually building? We're building a testbed. So we're trying to put this out into the field, into actual fiber that is beneath the ground, right? Phase one, we build something on campus. We build a QKD link, we have a basic key management thing on top. We have some network encryptors so we can show that we can use those keys to encrypt actual network traffic, right? That's more or less in place. We have something still to put under the ground, but at least in the lab, those things are in place. Main focus right now is on this. We're trying to actually say, okay, we have partners that are around Eindhoven with realistic fibers in the ground operated by other people, not fibers that we have full control over, but fibers that are within other people's networks. And we are able to put equipment in our location and in our partner's location and say, now we actually have the real challenge of how would this work in the real network. Right? We're still not using this to transmit live and real traffic from other people, right? But we're getting as close to that as we can. And here we have this project with WeConnect in Walra and Automotive Campus in Helmond that we say we want to put this in the ground. We want to have QKD for 2 parts of this connection. I have this in the next slide also, but we want to have QKD here. But in terms of the encrypted classical traffic, we actually want to have a full mesh. And then we have what I mentioned already, the national quantum staging network. That's where quantum delta is going towards, where we say, okay, we have these local networks that are now being deployed, and I have this also, again, with a little bit more detail, what are the other people around us deploying. But we want to eventually link all of those up and have a national quantum staging network, right? Have a network, more or less nationwide, that is ready in terms of the way that this network is designed, the way it's operated, the way that people think about it for QKD or quantum communication technologies.
Is the exclusion of Twente, is that political or geographical?
Neither. I think that was mostly based on who were the people in the room when this was drafted up, right? I don't think that's a very good answer, but that's where it came from.
Sort of
right?
geographical.
Not sure. It is not something that will persist. So you already see that Enschede is on that slide, right? There is no direct line there yet because we haven't figured out what actually should go over that line, but they're not excluded on purpose and they're not being actively excluded, right? So we actually want to bring Twente in. We have collaboration with them in Quantum Delta, and I'm absolutely sure there's more of that to come. They just were not in here when it was about who builds the first QKD networks. You also see that in this slide, BitTrack is missing. That has been fixed in the next slide. So there are changes happening there, right? So let's go to the next slide because that's actually the bigger project now, the so-called Euro QCI. So we have Quantum Delta, and then we have now a European project doing all of this together. And in this, we actually have 3 networks being deployed now. One, TU Delft and the governmental entities building something around Delft, The Hague, up to Amsterdam, which is really focused on purely how does this help the government, right? What is the governmental use case? There's obviously extreme security needs in governmental entities, right? If you think military, you think the diplomatic service, etc., right? There is definitely sensitive stuff there where we want to afford ourselves maximum security, right? So that's that network. In Eindhoven, we believe we're in the Brainport region, this very strong industrial, etc. region. So we said it's natural that we focus on what can this do for anybody who is not the government, right? So for industry, for network operators, etc. And then we were lucky enough that SURF is with us. I hope all of you know SURF, I suppose. Basically our NREN, our National Research Network Operator, right? And they now also build a small network around their headquarters. And right now, these are 3 local networks being deployed in this project. There is already the plan to actually link those up, right? And once you've made it to it, right, going across to Twente, I guess, is a step that we can do. And there is anyway follow up, a bigger plan to merge these local national staging networks, which are yet to become reality, into a pan-European staging network that is to become reality after the others have become reality, right? So we also have to keep in mind that there is a certain timeline to this, which is not short. Right?
So suppose we have these 3 networks, how easily can they be linked together? And do they need to be based on the same technology, for instance?
No. So based on the same technology is not needed. So as long as they can all generate keys, and as long as we can somehow agree on a mechanism to link up the key management layers, right? Mm-hmm. Then there's no need to be on the same technology. And in fact, here Delft will deploy NDI QKD, which is developed there, right? On our side, we're working with DV and CV QKD, so that's what we're deploying. SURF hasn't made a final decision yet what they are deploying, so there will not be a heterogeneous choice of technology. In terms of what the key management layer is, that's also not decided yet, but we are discussing mechanisms on how to interface those, right? So that's the second half of your question. How hard would it be to link them? Because you do need a QKD link between them, right? That's basically determined by distance. And I think between ourselves and Delft is on the border of what you might be able to do with either 2 DB links or a single NDI link. Challenge, but might be possible. Amsterdam Utrecht is no issue. Ourselves Utrecht is doable. Ourselves Twente would be doable distance-wise, but there's no fiber there, so it's a bit more tricky, right? So that will probably actually be a connection via Utrecht. So doable, but not without challenge. this is what we're building then locally, right? Sort of the very first step, right? You always start small. And the idea is we want to have this locally field deployed. So field deployed is the key part here. Fiber is in the ground, we use actual fiber. It's a very simple 3-node thing. As I said, the 2 upper legs of the triangle have QKD and classical encrypted traffic, but by relaying keys from Walra via TUE to Helmond, we can actually make an end-to-end encrypted link Walra Helmond on a classical channel, right? Physically, this is still going to go as a foreign wave via the fiber that goes to TV, because we don't have infinite money to buy or dig so much fiber. But in the end, logically, from a network concept, this is how this will look, right? And as was mentioned, we need to do something about this KMS, and it actually mentions here on the slide, we want to build a technology agnostic KMS, right? Exactly to deal with that fact that there is no single QKD technology that everybody prefers or that even has any kind of standard, right? So we need to be able to handle all of them. And then we need to integrate this into network management and control, which we already have for classical networks. And we need to figure out how to upgrade that to also take into account QKD. And then because we come from hardcore telecoms, we also need to figure out how would you actually interoperate that on a fiber level, right? Can we do this in the same fiber? Do we need a separate fibers, etc.? What are the physical optical effects there when we try to have all of this stuff sharing a fiber? All right, to give a few things what we have actually done, right? So just to take some pictures of how does this stuff look. Effectively, we have some QKD equipment here. Not sure why I've lost my pointer, but we have some QKD equipment here. So yeah, okay. We have some QKD equipment that's happily exchanging keys. In this case, right now, we're still using the key management system that comes with the boxes. We actually know that we can do better, and we're migrating to our own. And we have a set of network encryptors that basically do line rate encryption end-to-end, just point-to-point. So these are network encryptors on layer 2, so very low layer. They really take a data stream in, encrypted, and that's all that's, well, almost all that happens here, right? But this is effectively a way to show that you can do this at relatively high line rate, right? So right now we're doing this at 10 gigabits per second. The product itself can go to 40, there's products out to 100. So the idea is we want to show that you can do this on an actual hardware platform, so with minimal impact on the network, right? At line rates that are realistic for actual networks nowadays in the field, right? So what we basically show is we have done this. You can integrate this. It's maybe not quite ready yet to go, but actually it does work, right? And the good thing here is that if you design this proper and if you integrate it into your network proper, the actual impact on the classical network, which in the end is what you're trying to keep safe, right, is actually minimal, provided you make a few small adjustments that the classical network already provides you the mechanisms to make, right? So there's nothing here that breaks your network, because if I'm an operator or if I'm a data center operator, I cannot afford that my network is broken, right? I need to move towards something that is secure against the threat that we see upcoming. And I need to find ways to include that without actually breaking my network. And that's what we showed here with the very first test. This is how this looks in reality, bit of a mess. We're making this look nicer, etc. But there is also a point in showing this, which is, sure, it does what it's supposed to do. No, it's not yet ready to actually put it in a data center, right? So that's why I said the equipment itself also still needs to perform. Okay. How to integrate all of this with the network control and the orchestrator. I think here I mentioned most of these things already. We have some kind of classical network. We're adding now QKD. It's important to know that this QKD most likely is not going to be as fully meshed as the classical might be, right? Simply because the QKD is rather expensive, and because if we do the key relay correctly, this is not necessary. And then we have some kind of controller sitting on top that knows the topology, that figures out routing information for the classical and for the QKD, figures out how to get this key relaying set up end-to-end, figures out how to instruct the nodes to hand keys over to whatever the classical network needs, and then instructs the classical network to make that secure link, right? And obviously then we have a layer on top, which is the orchestrator, which knows everything about the resources in the network, and which is basically what you would talk to in order to request a service, right? But there's a whole lot of software layers that go in between until you can actually operate this in a similar way to a normal network. There's a few details on what is already standardized and what is not. Maybe we can more or less skip this. But basically, the definition of a QKD service and how to provision such a service, those are the challenges that come here when we think about network control and orchestration.
Yeah, maybe about myself first before I start in the technical details. I'm Sebastian. I'm a postdoc in the same group as Simon, where he is a hardware guy. I am very much a software and crypto guy. So most of that was, I'm happy that he knows what he's talking about. I hope that I know what I'm talking about in this part. But what I've been building right now is the key management system. So this is the local part for a QKD node where we cache the keys that come in from the QKD providers. So this is, my work starts when the QKD protocol is run and gives its output, which is the shared point-to-point key. We need to store that until it's used. Essentially, we want to run this QKD protocol continuously because the key rates are very low. That's why we try to cache it. And then we need to provide those keys to the clients, to the encryptors. In order to do this, we require secure authentication between the key management systems. The QKD protocols themselves also need this. If there is a pre-shared key between neighbors, we can just use that to do information theoretic secure max. However, if there, in the initialization, we may not assume that there are pre-shared keys, so we can initiate QKD with post-quantum authentication and then use the QKD material that comes out of the first session to authenticate subsequent sessions. But more importantly, in our networks, for end-to-end authentication, we do need post-quantum crypto because pre-sharing keys there doesn't really scale. And we haven't found a way to make the QKD network actually provide those keys in a meaningful way. So that leads us to the network architecture that we are building, which really relies on those trusted nodes. As Simon has explained, we are limited to point-to-point connections and we are limited in distance. So therefore, we need those trusted nodes to build a larger network. Yeah, and that's what we do when we do key relaying. Essentially, we re-encrypt keys as we transfer them over the network, but I will explain that more in more detail on the subsequent slides. And what we try to do is really reduce the trust that we need in the intermediate nodes. Ultimately, we do have to trust them if we want to build any of these trusted relay networks, but hopefully we can sort of reduce that trust to only provide computational protection as well against the compromises to those trusted nodes. So before talking about the key relaying, I'd like to talk a little bit about the system that we have in place. What does the cache that we have locally actually look like? So from the bottom, what you see here from what we call the quantum link layers, there comes the QKD output. And then we split that into two parts. And the reason is that we want, the one thing that we want our system to do is never assign a key twice to different applications, because that will lead to reusing a key, for example, in a one-time pad, which for obvious reasons destroys the security of the system. So we get our pool of keys where we can take keys in order to hand them out to the system, and we only use their half of the keys once we are instructed by our neighbor to do so. Now, the problem that we are left with is that a QKD protocol may still abort, and it could be that one side gets output while the other one doesn't yet. So therefore, we do need some confirmation before we know we can actually use the keys. So this is why on our side, we have this unconfirmed and confirmed pool of keys, and we split it into two. And we only start using the keys from the confirmed pool, and we wait for the other side to acknowledge that they have the keys. In this way, yeah, actually, there is a whole mechanism there to make sure that we stay in sync with our neighbor, and we, yeah, staying in sync is really the key word here. Now, That may, of course, be problematic when there is a link that has data going a lot in one direction, but not the other. Therefore, we do have a mechanism for redistributing keys where we can move keys from our pool to their pool. Or if the other side tells us, we can take keys from their pool and move them to our pool. There is a mechanism to do that. Either we do that automatically once the keys get too much out of balance, or we just wait for the SDN controller to tell us, now you should probably start redistributing those keys.
SDN?
Software-defined network. So this is the central controller that keeps track of how much key material is in certain pools. Maybe there's a big relay coming in and you need a lot of key material. Any questions at this point?
So if I understand correctly, what comes out of the QKD output, there you've already, normally, I guess in any QKD protocol, you have a lot of exchange material over the network and you throw, like you make part of it public and part of it is your key. That has already happened there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is really after all the sifting of the key and the full post-processing has already happened. And in fact, we also require that key material is already authenticated between the two endpoints.
So is it common that keys will then be unconfirmed?
No, typically this will never happen. The only way that an adversary can do that is when one side is given output already and then sends the final confirmation message to the other side. If the adversary drops that final message, then we get output on one side and not the other. Okay. And I believe that if the QKD protocol is properly designed, that's the only thing an adversary can do. We just got to make sure that that doesn't desync our entire system. And
yeah, thanks.
Okay, so then we come to the how actually is this relaying being done? So what we assume here is that there are pre-shared keys between these neighbors. So we have Alice who's connected to Bob, who's connected to Carol, who's connected to Dave. And for example, the key QAB is shared between Alice and Bob. What happens then is that that is the key that's actually going to be shared at the end between Alice and Dave. So first Alice instructs Bob. She gives the ID of that key. So the system has some way of knowing the identities of these different keys, key material. She then tells Bob, all right, this is the key that I now want to use with Dave. And then Bob knows that he should then connect to Carol, and I talk about how he knows that in the next slide. But he will then take that key and encrypt it using the key that he shared with Carol. And then Carol takes that key, decrypts it using the shared key, and then re-encrypts it for the next hop. So that takes care of the confidentiality on the links themselves. And then we also need to authenticate that everything happened correctly here. So what we do is we essentially put a tag, an information theoretic secure tag, MEC, at the end of every message. So we authenticate the entire message, including that encrypted key material. But it also includes stuff like routing information, those identities. And then the key that we use for that is actually taken from that shared key that we already have assumed we're beginning with. So that part is pretty straightforward. Now the danger here, of course, is that Bob and Carol actually see the end-to-end key that is being generated here for Alice and Dave. So we want to protect against compromises by Bob and Carol. The only way we can do that, unfortunately, is to fall back to computational cryptography. So we do a mutual key exchange, end-to-end authenticated key exchange, and we mix the keys together with the QKD output. So we have information theoretic security against outsiders, but only computational protection against insiders. And so that's the way that we do this key relay. So then, of course, it is very important for all the nodes to know where do we have to relay into. So this is where the routing happens. And we try to keep the routing as much separate from the rest of the KMS, where we actually do the storage and the key relaying. But of course, it does need to happen. We do need some protection there to make sure that our adversary doesn't route all traffic past a node that they control. Unfortunately, again, we can only secure this with computational authentication, but I've tried to illustrate here how we are currently doing it. So let's say that Alice receives a get key request, so she wants to share a key with Dave. Then before she starts relaying, Alice requests that route from some dedicated routing module. And currently that is just the central SDN controller, the software-defined network controller that knows this information and just gives the route back to Alice. Alternatively, there is some decentralized routing where they know the route. We don't care too much about that part. But then the important part here is that the routing module replies with the actual route, which is the full list of node IDs. And then we sign that entire route with a post-quantum key. And that makes sure that an adversary cannot change that route to relay past a node that they control. And then, of course, every hop in that relay needs to verify those routes. So verify the signature, but also make sure that the message actually comes from the node that you're expecting it from, and that you have a connection with the next hop in the network. Yeah, question.
In what way is this QKD network different from classical network?
It mostly isn't. A big part here is that we actually do care how it's routed, right? Classically, we don't care how a message is routed as long as it gets to the end. But since here we want to limit the trust that we have, we want to minimize the number of hops. And also a very limiting factor is that this QKD output rate is very low. So there may not be key material available. That's why we do it with the SDN controller, who also has knowledge of how much key material is in the key pool. Is there enough to actually do this routing? And as I said, we try to keep this interface very general so that there may also be other approaches. For example, you may indeed go more on a routing network as it's done classically, where you get a message and then start to look, okay, now what's my next hop? You locally compute that. You would have to still do some authentication and make sure that you give information about where the message comes from to the next hop, and in such a way that it's verifiable at the end, so they know which nodes have seen the key that I'm currently using. That's very much future work. I don't know how to do that. Probably signatures on signatures or something like that. We'd have to look into how to do that properly. For now, the central router is our solution within our network. Yeah.
You say how many nodes have seen the key that we want to share?
Yeah.
You previously said that the key was computational secure to the intermediate nodes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you mean with that?
We want to know who exactly are the nodes for which we only have computational security. Because for all the other parts of the network, it should be information theoretical secure. Okay, let's see if this works. Yeah. Can you maybe help me? While he's doing that, I'll explain, because this is the demo that we have. So what I've built here, the blue boxes that you see are the actual key management system. So that's really what I wanted to demonstrate here. The green ones on top are the applications, which in this case are just chat applications that can send messages back and forth encrypted with a one-time pad. And I think I also authenticate, but for demo purposes, it doesn't really matter. And in the bottom, what you see is my fake QKD boxes. So instead of an actual QKD box, I just used a seeded pseudo-random number generator to provide keys to the KMS. But what I want to demonstrate here is that we have these certificates, these KMSs, and then we can have multiple providers, providers that are connected between Alice and Bob. We also have providers that are between Bob and Carol. But then in the end, we can send messages from Alice to Carol and back. Of course, there's no nice user interface because who needs that? So you will see text flashing by on screen, and you have to trust me that I'm actually doing what I'm saying.
Yeah, if Zoom would like to cooperate, that would be great. Well, let me just share the entire screen and hopefully the video.
Doesn't look too bad.
So right now I'm booting up the key management systems, and they are initialized without any key material. It's all provided to them from the providers that I'm putting down there. What you're seeing now is I've started up one provider between Alice and Bob, and I believe they are now synced on that key material. I'm starting up a second provider between them to show that yes, we can handle multiple providers to increase bandwidth, and we can handle multiple providers using different technologies. I've also booted up the connection between Bob and Carol, and now my applications, you see that I can send messages from Alice to Bob, and then here we have a message going from Carol to Alice, which does arrive and decrypt. So they were able to grab the keys from the KMS. Pretty straightforward what's happening here. Demo. Unless there's any questions about so then we have, finally, after all this KMS stuff and key relaying is done, we finally have those end-to-end symmetric keys that have these certain security guarantees on them. And then we start integrating them with the classical network. So we can do that on any of the layers. On the physical layer, we can do it, we can encrypt devices to each other with max security. It integrates well with IPsec. I mean, anything that can use a symmetric key to do encryption, of course, here would work. Yeah, so this is the KMS is just relaying this. And as I said, what we really try to do is have the QKD just run continuously and provide more and more key material because yeah, it's slow. So we want to keep up with as much traffic as possible. And then, yeah, as I've explained in the different parts, we are going to need PQC. However, in the end, this is with providing end-to-end connections between the nodes in the network. But then on top of that, you probably want another layer where you do actual application end-to-end connections. Yeah, so either we can go, yeah, we should really talk about maybe what the real benefit is here of doing this instead of just using PQC, because that was a valid question that was asked before. And one thing that we see where we use PQC a lot for authentication, but in order to break that, you have to break it right now. As soon as the message has come across and it was authenticated and hasn't been broken at the time, then you cannot later go on and try to decrypt the data by looking at the ciphertext because it was encrypted with information theoretic secure key material. With a little caveat there that I'm assuming a one-time pad. When you start to go to AES there, things get a little trickier, but at least there's no post-quantum scheme involved there that can be decrypted after the fact. So this is really protecting against that harvest and decrypt attack that Simon was talking about earlier. Yeah, and then of course, we don't want to rely on QKD only, because for something that is unconditionally secure, there are actually a lot of ifs that need to hold for the system to be actually secure. There are side channels on the hardware. We have those trusted networks. So if any of those assumptions fail, we don't want to completely give up security. We want to fall back to that computational assumption that we can give with regular post-quantum cryptography, or maybe even classical elliptic curve cryptography, for example. Yeah, and then just to demonstrate this is work that a PhD in our group has done, where they integrated the both, I think it was both post-quantum and QKD.
So hybrid and lithium and QKD.
Yeah. So essentially, if you look at TLS, after the initial handshake, you compute a so-called master secret. Then you start mixing in post-quantum and QKD key material in there to secure the to create the entire session key, which is then used to authenticate the data, authenticate and encrypt the data that is within the TLS session. Yeah, so this is essentially I think this is a very old picture of maybe the different use cases.
Basically, this is the marketing slide, I think.
Yeah. There are talks about doing autonomous vehicles. It's going to be hard to put QKD boxes in the actual car, so it may just be the backbone that we're protecting there. And then, yeah, I think the boss is still in there, which is interesting. Do we have a link with them?
We do want to eventually hook up to Hieronymus Bosch, but I think that's still in the future.
But those are the use cases that we're currently considering, where this system actually makes sense, where we have this data that needs to be protected for a long time.
I'm going to ask you, call it the campus metro ring. Does it mean the topology is actually a circle?
I think so, right?
Yeah, so we have a circle on TU campus, which is relatively short, 2.5 kilometers. There is a metro ring around Eindhoven, which we are trying to see if we can get onto.
Like there's literally fiber running in a circle.
This is very common in metropolitan networks to have circular structures for protection reasons. So basically, you would send your data in one direction normally, but assume this fails. If you have a circle, you just send it the other way around, and you still have to link, right? So this is in classical networks, in local and metro, this most common structure you will actually have. And then you make links between the different metro rings. That's then your actual backbone, right?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, the most important slide, all the people that we're working with. Oh, I say all the people, and then Catherine is missing. That's not so nice. No, sorry about that. But this is the team on the EcoSec. Catherine is in the crypto department, and those people are. I guess Boris in there. Oh, this is really sloppy. Sorry, I'm sorry. This is really sloppy.
Yes, it's just an old
To
slide,
be
right?
updated.
It's an old slide. Yes, yes. Yeah, but just to summarize, what we're working on in Eindhoven is really the full stack, where we integrate the photonics and create a complete system. We try to identify all the gaps that are there in the existing standard and in the software that is needed to develop these networks. And also, there's part of our ongoing work where we actually try to model this stuff instead of doing hand-wavy security arguments, as is common when you step from the point-to-point link QKD to a network. So we try to model the full network, actually, which I think is relatively unique. And what I've seen in the literature myself, at least, and then actually demonstrate some use cases where, yes, this does work. I think I've gone over time quite a bit already, so let me just stop there. And yeah, if you have any questions.